Hi everybody, this is Trebor Healey. I am coming to you from Merida, Mexico, where I got stuck in all this. And I work with women and refugee children from Central America down here. So I'm going to read a story called Abelardo and Rodrigo, which is about that subject, from my new short story collection, Falling. I knew the boys were happy and shouting because of the coloring books, but I also knew this work now that I'd been doing it for 3 years off and on. I knew how quickly you could gain the trust and love of a small child if you smiled and brought the promise of fun and attention and ultimately just continued to show up and listen. I liked the work because it was easy. Children delighted me, and I had the special privilege of being one of the few males in such settings among children who'd lost many, if not most, of their older male role models. It was also good for my Spanish, as children are quick to point out grammatical and pronunciation mistakes and love being in a position of authority with an older person. I marveled at this very small way of empowering them with no real effort on my part. I wondered sometimes, of course, what they really thought of me in their inner world, or how they'd remember me 10 or 20 years on, when I hoped with all my heart that they'd have lives with some semblance of stability and safety, if not prosperity, fulfillment, and happiness. They were here under the care and sponsorship of an NGO that had grown out of the work of an order of nuns called the Scalabranianis. I'd begun with the nuns 3 years ago and was impressed with what they'd built and the system they'd set up with the government, giving them 3 months in which to establish these migrants' status as refugees, a not-so-easy task, even though many, if not all, of these people were fleeing murderous gangsters, policemen, soldiers, and the like. The refugee house also offered job training, basic stuff like cooking, sewing, rudimentary computer skills, and now medical and psychological care, along with language classes, as there were now many Portuguese and French-speaking Africans as well. I was here because I liked to come to Mexico for a few months at a time. I'd lost my wife and only child 5 years before when I'd crashed our single-engine Cessna Skyhawk west of Bridgeport in a freak lightning storm. I'd walked away physically unscathed, in a daze. And I wouldn't be the first person from up north who found succor in Mexico, a place easy to lose yourself in the otherworldliness of it, the smiling populace. I came to this work because of a certain little boy I'd seen once playing an accordion for change on the subway in Mexico City. He smiled at me in the way that only a child can, cutting through the differences that we conspire to believe exist between a 60-year-old American chemist with an advanced degree, 2 houses, 3 cars, and an airplane, and a child who most likely lived in a tin shack on the far edges of the city, who was focused almost exclusively and completely on food, and whose future was dubious at best. His musicianship was not good, though it was spirited. His smile, on the other hand, rivaled that of someone you loved with all your heart and you had known all your life. I began to look for him, and one day found him again on the same subway line. It was later in the day, and the train was crowded, and he'd ceased playing and was sitting on the floor, leaned up against the door that connected one train to the next, the accordion propped up by his side while he consumed an entire quart of chocolate ice cream with a relish I immediately envied. In that moment, all was right with his world, his animal world, I should say, and what else is there in the moment? He had more than I had right then, though I immediately thought of the folly of his joy, that he was malnourished, perhaps even older than he looked, and ice cream was the last thing he needed to spend his hard-earned money on. He needed fruits, vegetables, vitamins, a better protein source. He'd end up short with an underdeveloped brain. Perhaps he'd already arrived at the initial stages of that. But how could one deny him his pleasure, and how could one sentimentalize it? I felt guilty and impotent and resolved then to find a way to help these children. I couldn't save him or even help him, giving him more ice cream money. He was like a drunk or a drug addict that you gave spare change to with reservations, knowing you were feeding the problem, just as much as you knew you were keeping him alive for another day, a moral conundrum all of us know too well. I needed a strategy, an organization on the ground. I wrote to an Episcopal priest I knew back home. I wasn't a religious man, but I asked Father Ken because he was something of a radical who'd come to the priesthood after years as a junkie. He'd committed himself since then to serving the most vulnerable populations and currently pastored a small church in East LA. He'd been involved in the immigration battles for years, providing sanctuary, food, clothing, whatever he could. He'd spent a good deal of time on the Mexican side of the border as well, working with NGOs addressing the refugee crisis that had emerged with the social collapse in much of Central American society, a good deal of it brought on by U.S. intervention, exploitation, and the deportation of gangsters such as MS-13, who now plied their vicious, violent trade, learned on the streets of America's city of dreams, Los Angeles, from San Salvador all the way to Juarez. Most Americans couldn't or wouldn't see the connections. I'd ignored them too for much of my life, but I was different now after the plane crash. I couldn't turn anything off. Father Ken connected me to the nuns, who I then visited, offering my services as a volunteer. They told me I could do just about anything. I said I liked kids, and Sister Roberta smiled and said, "Good," because while the mothers were busy with their job training, 15 little kids were running around unsupervised on a concrete playground of the former parochial school that served as the refugee house. "Come whenever you want to," Sister Roberta told me, showing me out. She was sorry she had to leave so quickly, she apologized, but she just received a text that a teenage boy from Honduras was in the hospital, having lost a leg, hopping a train. She needed to get down there to try and secure a place for him at the refugee house and start the process of hopefully getting him papers to stay in Mexico and not be deported back to Honduras. All I could do was nod and thank her. "How old was he?" 14, she said. I decided to leave and come back in a day or two. I'd expected more structure, but was encouraged by the obvious need. I went to fairs and local parks the next day, as well as street mercados, collecting lesson books on mathematics, grammar, and the like, wondering how I was going to run a classroom with children ranging in age from 3 to 12. That first year, they were much less organized than they'd become in the following years. The parochial school was 2 stories, housing the boys and young men on the upper floor and the women and children on the lower. That first day, I found the children running around the playground, roughhousing, until a young nun appeared, offering a game of kickball. The kickball game soon collapsed into chaos, the younger kids in tears, while the older ones continued thrashing each other in pursuit of the ball until the nun was able to retrieve it and then comfort the little ones. The children were in no way timid, and once the ball was out of play, they became curious about the old gringo watching. They made their way over en masse and peppered me with questions. "What's your name? Where are you from? Do you speak English?" I answered them and then asked them the same questions and was treated to a cacophony of names and countries. I asked Isaiah about his broken arm, which he and 3 others reported had occurred when he'd climbed onto the roof and fallen on the way back down. He was 9 and very proud of his injury. I then pulled out my books and said I was here to teach them some things. Isaiah, like most of the older ones, furrowed his brows, while the little one showed curiosity for the colorful lesson books I held in my arms. There was no classroom space available, so we simply gathered in a circle and sat down on cement. In the weeks that followed, the nuns found me a dilapidated portable table and some folding chairs. The children at the refugee house that first year were beautiful, undisciplined, stubborn, distracted, and almost impossible to teach. I had my favorites, Kevin, yes, Kevin, as in Spanish for Kevin, and his mischievous grin, broken-armed Isaiah, who always knew the score, and no wonder, as it turned out that both his father and uncle had been murdered, and he'd spent 4 days on the bus with no food. He'd give me these knowing looks like, "Watch this," as he proceeded to lightly manipulate the other kids into little conflicts, or, believe it or not, into returning to their lessons. Elena I liked because she watched out for the little ones, who were the most vulnerable, like 3-year-old Jorge, who clung to my legs and called me Pappy as the snot ran from his nose. He struggled always with the older boys, whether over a crayon or a toy, and he always lost, dissolving into tears. I admired his chutzpah and tried to comfort him as best I could. When I returned a year later, the refugee house had moved and tightened its game. There was the doctor now, the psychologist, social workers, even a fundraiser. I was assigned to work with 2 little brothers from Honduras, Abelardo, 6, and Rodrigo, 4. There were more volunteers now, so the children were more engaged, and we could each work with just a few instead of me and a dozen or more, like before. I'd learned by then that coloring books were my ace in the hole, both as a reward for lessons completed as well as a good starting point for kids who were hard to reach or engage. For while children might give me a look of complete revulsion when I pulled out the grammar books, they would smile or even shout with glee when the libros de colorear were presented. Abelardo and Rodrigo were no different. Once I had them going, I would cunningly begin to educate. Animals led to sounds, as these 2 were quite young. Discussions about what they ate, what their young were called, and what parts of the world they lived in, and whether or not they would make a good pet. Abelardo only liked penguins and zebras, and I wonder if there was something to the fact that they were black and white. But who knows, I'd since dispensed with Freudian analysis. Besides, Abelardo colored his penguins in a rainbow of colors. Pink and green penguins frolicked on purple ice, trading blue, yellow, and orange eggs under a red sky. Abelardo was generally sweet-natured, but he would get stubborn and demanding, though he'd usually cap it with a smile, letting me know he meant business, but was strangely aware of the absurdity of his temper. "Penguins, more penguins, I don't want these bears and rabbits." He'd sometimes go so far as to tear those pages out. "I need bread," he'd shout when he was hungry, and Rodrigo would soon chime in. It was odd they never said they were hungry, only this kind of medieval chant for the basic foodstuff of much of the world, though not necessarily theirs. I'd explain that they'd need to wait, but that lunchtime would be soon. Rodrigo was more temperamental and would become defiant if he were not getting his due attention-wise. He generally followed what Abelardo did and adopted his big brother's likes and dislikes. I remembered my own childhood and how my older brothers were proprietary and didn't like me liking what they liked. I could see how for children it could feel smothering and annoying to have someone following you around and copying your every move right down to your preferences, which you were learning were very individualized. Abelardo never seemed bothered, though, and it touched me how indulgent he was toward Rodrigo, who would actually smack his older brother in his more ornery moments because he needed elbow room or a particular color of crayon that Abelardo was using. Abelardo would wait a short time, then give up the crayon and never retaliate to the slaps and slights. I came to admire Abelardo for it, and would tell him he was a very kind big brother and that was a good thing. But his forbearance seemed more a part of his nature, and he would simply look up at me, smile, and continue to color.